Today's lecture is Crafted, Objects in Flux, presented by Emily Zilber, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston's first Ronald L. and Anita C. Wornick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts. Zilber is responsible for the MFA's vibrant program of contemporary decorative arts, including guiding acquisitions and developing a presence for craft and design in the Lindy Family Wing for contemporary art and throughout the museum. Zilber oversees the Daphne and Peter Farago Gallery, a dedicated space within the Lindy Family Wing for modern and contemporary craft, design, and decorative arts. The gallery opened in September 2011 with Crafting Contemporary, selections from the Daphne Farago collection. Recent projects include the exhibition New Blue and White, which focused on contemporary interpretations of blue and white traditions by artists and designers across media in 2013, and the reinstallation of the Farago Gallery with works from the MFA's permanent collection. Current projects include the exhibition Nature, Sculpture, Abstraction, and Clay, 100 Years of American Ceramics, which opened in January of this year, and Crafted, Objects in Flux, which opened in August of this year and is the inspiration for this course. Prior to joining the MFA, Zilber was assistant curator at Cranbrook Art Museum at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. She has edited and written for numerous publications, speaks regularly on topics related to 20th and 21st century decorative arts, craft, and design, and is a founding member of the Boston-based consortium, the Commonwealth of Craft. Zilber holds a BA in Art History from the University of Chicago and an MA from the Bard Graduate Center for Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture. And on this Thursday, we will be announcing the winter-spring season of lectures and courses, so check out mfa.org starting this Thursday. Tickets will go on sale Thursday, January 7th at 10 a.m. Thursday, January 7th at 10 a.m. Thank you for joining us this fall. Happy holidays, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Emily Zilber.
Well, thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you, Jasmine, for that kind introduction. I'm really pleased that you're joining me for the last segment of the Road to Contemporary Craft course, and I'm really thrilled that we're going to close with an in-depth look at many of the artists featured in the current exhibition, Crafted, Objects in Flux. I hope many of you, if not everyone here, has had a chance to see the show, and so you'll actually have experienced and know some of the works that I'll be talking about rather than just seeing them on the screen. If you've not seen the show, great opportunity to leave the lecture today and head over to the Foster Gallery in the Lindy Family Wing to take a peek. Crafted, Objects in Flux introduces a selection of international and cross-generational artists working in a variety of contexts who share a key goal: to encourage us to question craft as being bound to a limited framework or definition in the context of art making, and to see it in new and perhaps startling and contradictory ways. Today, more than ever, the distinctions between art, design, and craft are shifting and porous. The works on view in the exhibition straddle those boundaries, and so are objects in flux. They're objects sort of in a state of continuous change, objects that really reach to and speak across boundaries. We'll take a quick step backwards, though. Each artwork in this exhibition was produced using materials, forms, or ideas connected to how craft has traditionally been defined, and I'm sure that you got some of this in your previous course sessions. We're talking about skillfully made objects, usually by hand, either functional or non-functional, from wood, fiber, metal, jewelry, furniture, glass, and clay. This is the kind of material our encyclopedic collection shows as it shows changing craft traditions across millennia. I like to say that the MFA is really just a big craft museum. If you're looking at skilled work, in particular media, over time, that's most of what we have here. We have in our collection from ancient vessels and jewelry Tiffany glass and silver to more contemporary works created as a part of the 20th century studio craft movement on view in places like the American Wing and the Farrago Gallery. One of the things I want to note out is that the definition of contemporary craft changes all the time. I'm showing here a work, a Tiffany & Company picture, beautifully handmade in silver and copper, that's on view in the American Wing from 1875. The museum opened in July of 1876. The work was made, again, 1875, and given to the museum in 1877. It is, in fact, the first piece of contemporary craft to enter our collection. So that lovely maxim that we have up in the Lindy family wing, all art has been contemporary, all craft has been contemporary too. Studio craft is something that I know you've talked about in previous sessions, but we have a wonderful collection of that material too, embodied by works like the work by Peter Volkas that I'm showing here, which is currently on view in Nature, Sculpture, Abstraction, and Clay in the American Wing. And when I say studio craft, I know you've talked about this, but let's have a working definition we can use together. I'm talking about works that emerge out of the rapid growth in the study of craft disciplines in post-war United States, combined with a growth of artists who are skilled in making in these areas, looking to use craft materials for artistic purposes and working independently in studios rather than as part of a sort of design firm or some kind of larger practice. Independent artists working in their studios gives us the studio in studio craft, creating either functional or non-functional objects and playing with some of what we think of when we think of what makes an object craft. So Peter Volkas, for example, trained in more traditional ceramics, made functional wares in the beginning of his career, but really wanted to think about ceramics within the context of sculpture. And we're seeing a work here made around this time when he's shifting the way he's thinking about clay that has many of the hallmarks of a traditional vessel. It has a neck, it has the base here, it has the body. We can look at it and see a vessel. We can also look at it and see something that is really about an individual's artistic voice. It is totally, doesn't have the sort of finesse that we come to think of, or demonstrable finesse. It's much more expressionistic. It sort of speaks to Volkas's engagement with other art movements of the time, specifically abstract expressionist painting. We have materials that wouldn't typically be used with clay. Here we're looking at epoxies rather than glazes. And of course, you know, this is about Volkas, and we can see his name signed in the corner like an artist would sign the corner of a painting. So these works that are in sort of a blur zone, this blur zone is not something that's really just unique to contemporary craft. It really is at the core, the foundation of studio craft. So today's artists marry these kinds of considerations to an expanded range of materials, ways of making, conceptual approaches, and modes of display. So some media and forms that you might not expect to be part of a craft exhibition, including video, photography, digital fabrication, installation, and sound art, some of which you can see here in these images from the exhibition that I'm showing you. Show a kind of expanded nature to how contemporary artists doing skilled work in craft media and forms are thinking about what it means to engage with craft. The show features 50 works of art by 41 international and cross-generational artists, either working individually or collaboratively. Approximately a third of the exhibition is composed of works making their public debut, which is very exciting for us, and all of the work in the show has been produced since 2003, so we're talking about 21st century concerns. During the talk today, I'll present an overview of the project and themes explored in the show by looking at several artists from each thematic section. The show is organized in 3 thematic sections, as is the catalog: the performative object, the retooled object, and the immersive object. Each section of the show begins with an overarching question that is intended to give the viewer a quick framework for encountering the works on view, even if they don't read the whole label. And you have those questions listed on your handout, so you can take them home, and I hope that you do use them to think about not just the works in this show, but perhaps other works throughout the museum. So let's talk first about the performative object. How might an object be made through performance, perform in the world, or perform its own making? We can imagine things like wheel throwing a ceramic vessel or blowing glass. There's a sort of physical theater to making an object that requires often not just a choreography between the maker and the material, but say in the case of glass blowing, between various persons who are making sure that that work happens in a safe and productive kind of way. Likewise, the functional nature of many crafted works, we might think of cups or vases or furniture or jewelry, tied to a variety of human rituals and behaviors, and the crafted object becomes a tool in the performance of everyday life. Your morning doesn't happen in quite the same way if you don't have that mug that you start your morning with, right? Those objects help us perform our rituals. Objects may perform while even on pedestals by alluding to process or seemingly encouraging the viewer to handle, alter, or even participate with them. They might be used in or be the result of actions in craft-based practices aimed at building community or new social construction. Again, this is not something that is new to the 21st century. And I want to bring folks' attention to works like that of the artist Jim Melchert, a ceramic artist, again, most commonly known as an object maker, but we're looking at photographs of a performance that he did here in 1970 called Changes, in which he took several people, put together vats of slip, which is liquid clay, had people dip their heads in the slip, and positioned them at different areas in the gallery so that they could experience the effects of the material drying at different rates. So again, the performative impulse in craft is something that has been around. It's not entirely new. The artists who are working today are building on that. It's a question of the frequency with which we encounter it and the frequency with which artists go to those traditions that I think is part of what's changing in the last several decades. And we're going to start by looking at artwork here by an artist, Etsuko Ichikawa, who thinks about craft making as performance. She's one of a growing number of contemporary artists who use molten glass performatively rather than to make glass objects. So I'm showing you here not glass objects, 2 drawings. She creates works called pyrographs, literally writing with fire, which capture the immediate and ephemeral impact of molten glass and fire on paper and express the fluid movements performed by both body and material in the making of each work. Pyrography is an art form that has a long history. We usually think about it used to talk about the burning of designs with fire into wood. Rarely do we use it, only in this case, as far as I know, to talk about glass on paper. After studying painting, Etsuko Ichikawa learned glassmaking at the Tokyo Glass Art Institute in her native Japan. She moved to the United States in her early 30s to study at Pilchuck, the renowned Washington glass school founded by Dale Chihuly, and she spent almost a decade working there. And I'm showing here some really wonderful photographs of how these works are made. So you can see the artist here trailing her material over paper. Intensive training in glassmaking is essential, as Ichikawa's practice depends on a deep understanding of and commitment to the many aspects of glass. We're talking about physical properties, complex technical processes that are used to handle it, specialized equipment and production spaces needed to facilitate working with a material whose temperature often exceeds 2,000 degrees. So you have to know exactly how long you can leave that 2,000 degree material on paper to get a mark and not a burn. It's an incredibly in-depth knowledge of glass that's required. She's developed all this knowledge, however, to make what are essentially drawings, not to make objects. Her performance-based work results in a tangible thing that's at once evidence of artistic action and an outcome in its own right. So when you look at the trailing of the line across this paper, you can't help but see the way that the glass has moved over the paper. Her practice, like that of many glassblowers, is highly dependent on bodily performance that can be very dance-like. She actually teaches workshops to dancers based on the movements she engages in her work, such as gathering, blowing, rolling, and pulling the material. The overwhelmingly physical nature of her practice has brought a significant public component to it, involving improvisational and choreographed performances set to live music. I'm showing here images from a 2010 performance at the Tacoma Museum of Glass in Washington State. The performance is actually available on YouTube if you're so inclined to take a look at it after the class. She worked with a dancer and 6 other glassblowers to choreograph and perform a work set to the Russian composer Stravinsky's 1910 ballet, The Firebird. Apropos. Originally written for the Ballet Russe and based on native folk tales about a magical luminescent bird which brings both blessings and curses to its captor, Stravinsky is thought to have based the ballet's plot on an 1844 poem by Yakov Polonsky titled A Winter's Journey, which contains the words, and I'm quoting here, "Their gardens surround a palace all of glass, their firebirds sing by night." So she's really bringing something out in the music that was there to begin with. Her performance echoed the link between glass and fire, setting specific moments in the making process, such as the starting points of a gather from the furnace. We can see here the furnaces behind us that she was using, or the placement of the blowpipe into the glory hole in time with Stravinsky's music. And of course, we have the dancer working with her as she is making a large-scale pyrograph as a result of this performance. So we're really talking about something that approaches theater in its practice. A different way of thinking about performance here. What does it mean to use a crafted object to perform everyday life? For the artist Qianwei Chang, trained in jewelry making and metalworking in Taipei and London, a drastic reimagining of scale in his very aptly named huge ladle shifts the typical performance associated with an everyday utensil for the serving of food into one that demands a different kind of bodily action. So that anecdote about your mug that you're sitting at the table, you're performing your morning ritual with, what would happen if that mug suddenly shifted? If it had 2 handles instead of 1, if it grew in size or became smaller, your performance is a little different. Here, the oversized bowl of the ladle in silver is attached to a handle that extends the length of the work to over 5 feet. It alters and defies the domestic functions for which the form is intended, as you can see in this photograph. To manipulate the utensil, the body has to be used in an entirely new fashion. So through this kind of repositioning, the ladle is anthropomorphized. It becomes a dance partner with its body and head held aloft, and it's dependent on its partner's strength and agility for its use. So when you go into the gallery, when you see this piece, you'll notice that we've displayed it so that the bowl of the ladle is relatively close to the face of the viewer who is looking at it. It has that kind of bodily connection. The ladle form also functions in Chang's work on a personal level as a metaphor for the ability to retain multiple perspectives concurrently during the process of acculturation. So Chang left Taiwan for the United Kingdom in his late 20s, and he likens the process of moving from one culture to another, and I'm quoting the artist here. He likens it to the movement of scooping something out of one container, then pouring into another one, to his own daily ritual of, and I quote, abandoning the old knowledge about this world and refilling the new understanding inside me. So a tremendous kind of act. He's making a tool that's up to the challenge in terms of its scale, but it really changes the way that it must be used performatively. These notions of partnership, duality, and metaphor allow the ladle, this kind of inanimate object, to be both a tool and a teammate in a navigation of a shifted reality, a sort of material prop that speaks to larger performance. And it's one of the reasons why we have the object in the exhibition, but we also have this wonderful photograph as well, so you can see the body engaging with the piece. The performance of everyday life through objects is also at play in Susie Ganch's work, Drag, which, while centered in jewelry and metalsmithing, engages primarily with materials that depart from traditional values associated with the field, although not traditional values around modes of making. If you look at the piece, you'll notice that it's beautifully crafted, right? So she's definitely looked to skill as a craft value, not so much the traditional materials. She builds on the interests of studio jewelers in the 1960s and the 1970s, many of whom eschewed precious and costly gems and metals in favor of newly available materials such as plastics, rubbers, natural materials not typically used in jewelry like wood, and also cast-off recycled mass-market objects, which is what Ganch is looking at here. This is a piece that is quite beautiful, quite elegant in this photograph, and when you get close to it, it becomes something else entirely. Ganch's use of thrown-away materials is grounded in a public and passionate commitment to global environmentalism and political change. With the metalsmith Christina T. Miller, she co-directs a robust traveling education and making program called Radical Jewelry Makeover. It's been hosted at more than 20 sites internationally, and it came to Mass Art this November. I hope that some of you had a chance to go and see the works that were produced as a part of this project. So this is as much her artistic practice as the making of objects. Community-centered actions by Radical Jewelry Makeover focus on the social and environmental impacts of jewelry production by shedding light on irresponsible mining practices ranging from egregious labor violations to the destruction of ecosystems. They also advocate for the creation of a jewelry market that uses ethically sourced and recycled materials. So what happened in her sort of performance project at Mass Art this November is that students and alums collected both trash but also jewelry that was no longer being worn, no longer worthwhile to the owner anymore, and were taught by Ganch and by Miller how to reuse those materials in the making of new jewelry rather than adding new things to the ecosystem. And I'm showing two works that are part of the Radical Jewelry Makeover production. Here you can see that this ring is made using a piece that's been salvaged from a Tiffany & Company object. So you've got a little bit of the history of the object in there as well. So measuring 11 feet long, Drag is anchored at the wrist and extends outward in space through a series of incrementally larger, hand-formed circular chains decorated with beaded spokes. This is like any other chain link necklace or bracelet you might see. It's just been scaled up. Closer inspection reveals that the work is essentially composed of bits and pieces of trash, really lovingly handled. Disposable spoons, styrofoam cups, buttons, segments of plastic toys, and all other manner of detritus decorate a bracelet that literally hangs on the ground behind the wearer. I think it's wonderful here that you can see the Starbucks cup, right? Things that are familiar to all of us. I will say, because people often ask, what she's done here to create this ombre effect is not add color, but she's actually sorted through the trash so that she gets the right colors of trash, right? This is material that, even though it's been thrown away, is treated really respectfully and lovingly. Each piece is sort of set as you might set a precious bead or a precious stone. It's cultivated, it's carefully considered. The title evokes a number of different contexts. We might think of drag in the context of clothing that signifies a performance. You put on a drag to sort of go out into different identities. We also think of the physical dragging that's inherent in this bracelet. So what happens if you needed to actually physically carry around all of the things that we throw away and we don't think about anymore? What happens if you had to perform that kind of experience. So we're looking at a piece that has that performative nature in how the piece of jewelry is worn that really plays on the idea that jewelry always affects how we move our bodies, right? I'm not going to shake my head back and forth if I've got big earrings on because I'm going to feel, right? I'm going to move my head in a different way. She's just taking it to that nth extreme. Sonia Clark's work also looks at craft practice in the public sphere as a performance. For Clark, hairdressing is the primordial fiber art. In the Haircraft project, Clark visited 11 hairdressers over a period of a year and invited them to demonstrate their ample skills for twisting, braiding, and beading on 2 different supports, which I'm showing here. Clark's own head, and so we're seeing the back of the artist's head here, and a canvas primed with threads to echo strands of hair. And so what we're seeing in the corner here are the canvases as the artists receive, actually we have the canvases as the artists receive them in both of these images, right? Here we just have strands of silk that have been sewn into the canvas so that they resemble the back of a head of hair. So here is the work as it hangs in the exhibition. Each stylist's work was documented through photographs of the back of the artist's head. Standing next to Clark in the frame, we'll go up here so you can see that here. Standing next to Clark in the frame, the stylist herself provides a human connection and authorship to a craft that tends to remain anonymous once it transitions out of the salon and onto the street. Although I will say, I visited Sonia when she was wearing this hairstyle on her head and she could not walk 2 blocks without somebody stopping her. So it's not quite so anonymous. Sonia Clark confuses the boundaries between hand skills that lead us to an object, which is what we're seeing here, very easily understood as fiber art, and hand skills that lead us to something ephemeral like hair work, asking us to envision these 2 practices as equal participants in a creative arena whose value system is sort of influenced by our understandings and our prejudices against what is art, what is craft, what is beauty, what is sort of ephemeral, and what is not. The haircrafts depicted in the photographs and canvases that resulted from these interactions with the Black hairdressing community of Richmond, Virginia, where she lives, once they entered into a gallery context, were reframed no longer as bodily adornments, but as art objects. So she's showing them in a gallery space for the first time, asking us to think of both the gallery and the salon as potentially equivalent, and I'm quoting here, sites of aesthetics, craft, skill, improvisation, and commerce. It happens in both spaces. Departing from a typical gallery practice, the Haircraft project was shown for the first time, and each stylist's work was judged publicly by a jury as might occur at a hair show. I'm showing you the winners here. Except the judges were not salon experts, but rather 2 women, Lowry Stokes Sims, a curator at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, and if her name sounds familiar, she's also the editor of the wonderful Commonwealth book about African American art in the MFA's collection. And the woman I'm showing, that's Lowry, and the woman I'm showing here, Alalia Bundles, the great-granddaughter of the African-American hair product magnate, philanthropist, and first self-made female millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker, who made her money with these hair care products for African-American women so that their hair would become straight and more like Caucasian hair. That's something that Sonia Clark has been very interested in her work, and I thought it was worth showing this previous work of Sonia's from 2008, where she did, this is about 8 feet tall, a wonderful portrait of Madam C.J. Walker made from combs. And you can see the detail of that here. So very much a part of the artist's larger practice. So we've got this kind of performative element here in the way that this is very much about building a community, community-centered engagement with work. Clark also uses sort of more theatrical style performance art in her practice. I hope that some of you had a chance to see her performance, Hairdressers Are My Heroes, October 12th in the Richard B. Carter Gallery, our African gallery here at the museum, in which Sonia had been working with historic works at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and had been working with stylists in Richmond to have them do her hair after pieces in the collection. She decided in coming to our institution she wanted to take this into a public space. Choosing to work with a helmet mask from the Vai peoples in Sierra Leone, part of our collection, which I think if you walked past in the gallery, you would not realize that this depicts a very elaborate hairstyle. It seems stylized. It doesn't seem sort of like it could be a real hairstyle. So Sonia worked with a wonderful stylist based in Malden, Massachusetts, named Kathy Montreville, and actually set up spot in our gallery. You can see the piece that she's working with here, right behind her. So she's taking this practice that is often done in a certain context into a public sphere, but also into a sphere that is about sort of artistic practice and not what we think of when we normally think of hairstyling, right? This is about art and the skills that Kathy, the hairstylist, is showing here, the sort of braiding, twisting, plaiting. It takes on another dimension. Over the course of the 6 hours that it took to produce the hairstyle, we had 1,000 people come through the gallery, starting conversations about not just what Sonia and Kathy were doing. They stopped, they talked the whole time to all of these folks who came through, but asking her, how do you do that? What's the practice behind that? Why are you using those materials? These questions that we ask about craft practices. And I'll show here, this is a side view, a photograph of the completed work, which she then wore for 2 days before, unfortunately, having to take it out because it's very hard to sleep on. So we can come back to the practical nature. But this is taking this practice that is steeped in object making. Again, Sonia's been working with textiles for over 20 years, primarily as an object maker with fiber, and bringing it into a performative context. Clark's work at the MFA is, it's a clear performance in that kind of theatrical sense, but the performative in craft doesn't just apply to work like Clark's. So we can ask, how might an object perform while still on a pedestal? I'm showing here a work by the Danish artist Christina Schuh Christensen, and she explores this deceptively simple question with regard to the glazed ceramic object. So with a typical glaze, with everything that you would see if you went up to nature, sculpture, abstraction, and clay, you have a vitrified coating that clings to the surface of the clay underneath, hiding a kind of matte and porous surface. It serves a protective function, right? We can eat and drink from a vessel that's glazed because it doesn't seep into the clay, right? It's otherwise permeable. It also serves an ornamental one, transforming clay, stuff of the earth, into something perhaps refined and delicate or bright. You can really shift the material through the use of glaze as a surface coating. Christensen does not ask for either protection or decoration from her glazes. Instead, they give the works their very form, and they allow the unmediated surface of the ceramic object to be fully visible, right? We're not disguising here that we're looking at clay. She produces vessels marked by networks of holes, and then fills the interior with glaze and fires them. Depending on a range of factors, including kiln temperature, the size and number of holes, the firing tools used, and the individual glaze chemistries, the glaze melts and protrudes through the vessel, and in turn becomes a fundamental component determining the exterior form of each work. We're looking at a piece here called Blue-Legged Bowl 2, where the glaze shapes itself into a recognizable foot. It lifts the cup of the bowl up so that it resembles a chalice, although certainly not one that could be handled comfortably. It's hard to imagine picking that glass up by its stem, because it's essentially made from a number of thin strands of glass. In Dark Blue Bubbles, this is a piece from 2014, a cluster of smaller vessels are fused together with varying lengths of glaze protruding from them. When used in this way, glaze, even when made static, continues to resemble its qualities in the process of melting, right? It hasn't taken on the shape of the vessel underneath it. It becomes itself as it is moving. It has the sense that it is still vitreous. It's still, sort of wrapping around itself. The works are fundamentally performative objects, forever suspended in and acting out what is really a seemingly impossible moment. It sort of provides us a look into the kiln as the glaze is melting, even though that's not what's happened. The object has resolved itself. So the use of materials in an unusual or unconventional set of ways moves us to the second theme of the exhibition and the sort of second look at how we might think about craft pushing some of these boundaries in the 21st century. We're looking here at the retooled object. How do new modes of fabrication, whether digital or analog, expand artistic possibilities? A conventional definition of craft emphasizes artistic mastery of complicated and transformative material practices, typically tied to work done by hand. Yet I would argue that as much as craft is centered in the hand, it's also centered in the tool. There are very few media, craft or otherwise, that artists work with in which it is just the hand and the material, right? That potter who is working on the potter's wheel is using a tool. The artist who is turning a wood bowl on a lathe is using a tool. We think of a chisel, we think of a soldering iron. These are all tools, and certainly that treadle lathe from the 18th century is very different from a contemporary electric lathe, and yet we don't say that word-turned vessel is any less handmade. So craft retools throughout history. It's about the hand, but it's also about how making happens in different ways based on the tools that are available to an artist. The long history of innovation in craft shows this kind of continual re-envisioning. Today we're looking at a toolkit for craft that ranges from analog to digital, and we'll talk about some of those options as we go through. I've given you a sort of longer historical example, but it's also not as new as it might seem, even within the context of some modes of making, some tools that are being touted as really new. One example here, the husband and wife team of Stanley Lexon and Daniela Kerner have used computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing, CAD/CAM is how I'll refer to it from now on, to produce artist jewelry for decades. Lexon has been working with computers since 1978, and he actually designed the first university-level CAD/CAM course for jewelry makers, for artists, in 1989 at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. So we're hearing all this stuff about digital fabrication, 3D printing, as though it's something new. This is something that we've seen for decades. Interesting that Lexon brought this to Tyler in 1989. He had been working there since 1962. So we don't just have an artist coming in and saying, I'm bringing the new with me. We have an artist who is steeped in traditional making, retooling his practice over the course of a very long career. According to Lexon, CAD/CAM is a new craft media. He has said, if we wish to speak to and about our time, is there a better medium to use than the technology developed by this highly industrialized society? The duo has made this otherworldly wearable through a process called stereolithography, otherwise known as SLA, in which thin layers of material, in this case resin, are printed and cured with ultraviolet light. They are joined with glass-filled nylon created using a process called selective laser sintering, SLS, an additive production technique that divides an object into layers of material and binds them with a laser. So you're looking at two pieces here. We've got the nylon and the resin, and then rare earth magnets between. And so to wear this, you would sort of wear it over a scarf. You could take the first part off the bottom part, put the piece of fabric in between. The magnets would adhere it together so that you couldn't see the clasp. So a really beautiful and ingenious design. As I said before, Lexon's a really interesting example of an artist who has been retooling his entire career. In the so this experimentation with CAD/CAM is not even the first major retooling Lexon has done. In the 60s and 70s, his experiments with electroforming an industrial process for metal plating modeled forms, placed him at the forefront of the American studio craft jewelry movement. The process dates to the 19th century, electroforming, but Lexon is the first to adapt it for artistic purposes, plating metals over carved styrofoam or wax that had been melted and poured into water. And what that lets you do is create large-scale objects that are relatively light, full-bodied yet wearable sculptural forms. And when you're working with, say, wax that's been poured in water and you can plate over it, you get a kind of natural, organic structure that grows during the process of the electroforming that can create objects that seem sort of somewhat natural and somewhat man-made. So I'm showing here a work from the collection of the Museum of Arts and Design that has been produced using that electroforming process. But here he's still working too with amethyst, with freshwater pearls, with the materials that we think of when we think of jewelry. Although it takes highly skilled labor and extended time to create brooches using CAD/CAM, Lexon and Kerner rebel against traditional markers of quote-unquote good craft, including visible labor and time-intensive handwork. They do that now, not necessarily over the course of the whole career. For them, and I'm quoting again here, technical achievements or the amount of time it takes to arrive at an answer are no longer values as far as we're concerned. What matters instead is innovation in both materials and process used to fully engage the tools offered by the contemporary world. They're using CAD and 3D printing as this new craft medium and considering not just the objects that are on view in the gallery as their practice, but also the work that I'm showing you here. This is the digital rendering of that brooch, what it was like before it was printed. They're considering this the realization of a piece of jewelry, of a new craft object. Much of Doug Bucci's innovative work with digital fabrication reflects his own experience as a type 1 diabetic, a focus he developed after learning that two artists whose work held significant influence for him, the Bay Area funk jewelers Ken Corey and Don Tompkins, had died as a result of complications from the disease. Using CAD/CAM allows Bucci to investigate biological systems, both healthy and broken, taking formal cues from the way disease can impact a body. So methods of measuring illness, such as resonant imaging and blood glucose data drawn from continuous glucose monitoring, or called CGM, devices, guide the shape and form of Bucci's objects. He's worked here with a diabetes research scientist to develop an algorithm to transfer his own CGM, his own glucose data, which reflects different levels of stress and diet, into CAD renderings. Diabetes mellitus, which is the full name for his disease, translates from the Latin as siphon honey. And his neck pieces, which he began producing in 2010, take their shape from this literal meaning. We're looking at a hexagonal honeycomb structure to represent this uncorrupted cellular form that gives us, whose shape is taken largely from the changing CGM data. The form, however, once printed, is hand-dyed. So we're looking at a mixture of technological practices and handwork. Bucci's work is heavily informed by earlier pioneers in the retooling of craft in the body, like Marianne Scher, whose work is in this collection, although not this piece. This is her 1973 heart pulse sensor bracelet. This work includes a sensor monitor for the heart with an electronic light that indicates the beat rate. A radical change in the beat triggers a sound device and a small compartment that contains medication. So think of this as sort of the 1970s version of the Fitbit in many ways, right? We're creating numerous work, or Scher has created numerous works which anticipate our current fascination with self-monitoring our health data, and like Bucci, has translated them into artwork through a combination of new and old methods of making. Of course, Scher here is working with sort of more traditional metalworking, but the idea is the same. It lets you wonder what she would have done had she had CAD/CAM at that point in her career. Scher's example also presages the work of an artist like Norwood Viviano, who is dependent on the intermingling of old and new technologies. Working with digital rendering and printing technologies since the early 2000s, glass sculptor Viviano takes the abstraction of data as his subject, focusing primarily on physical and visual maps that measure demographics and industry in the United States. The works in his ongoing mining industry series tell the stories of a number of American cities from various parts of the country and their respective responses to the decline of the manufacturing economy at the turn of the 21st century. Again, this is also an artist who isn't just working with new technologies, but his work is essentially about how we change how we make, right? When we're talking about the decline of the manufacturing industries. Perched atop tall pedestals, transparent glass constructions show how the physical landscape of a city has changed over time. And I'm showing here new works that were made for this exhibition, his interest in engaging with the history of Boston. I hope you can see the Prudential Tower here, downtown Boston here, and the Port of Boston here. That's juxtaposed in the exhibition with the site of the Lawrence Manufacturing Company in Lowell, Massachusetts, a textile mill incorporated in 1831 at the height of the textile industry in New England. The Lawrence Manufacturing Company was the site of a large fire, unfortunately, in 1987, well after much of the textile manufacturing industry had left New England. And although the site was abandoned by that time, most of its buildings were lost. You can really see this here in the sort of low-slung nature of the topography versus the height that we get in Boston, where we have sort of robust industries of things like biotech and education. To express multiple temporal moments in a single work, Viviano is using data, mapping data from a number of sources, collected at different points across the 20th century. They range from 3D printed renderings of light detection and ranging data, also known as LiDAR. This is available to you if you're so inclined. Just Google LiDAR and you can bring it right up. It's accumulated by the US Geological Survey and uses a laser and its reflected light to measure distance. He's also thinking about aerial photography and sandborne maps, hand-drawn maps used to assess fire insurance risk. I'm showing you an example of a sandborne map here and that 3D model taken from LiDAR data here. So Viviano is creating digital renderings of the LiDAR maps. They're printed in plastic through a 3D printing process. They're reproduced, and you're seeing that 3D printed plastic piece here. They're reproduced in wax. You're seeing that here with the artist, and the artist here is tooling and changing some of the detail on that print. Those are then used to create molds that are cast in glass. And so you're seeing the final form here. So we have a really interesting opportunity here to look at an artist whose work is dependent on digital imaging, dependent on digital rendering and 3D printing, but uses historical glass casting techniques to create their final form. And if we come back to the final piece here, glass is really used for its ability to allow the viewer to see across and through time as images are simultaneously manipulated and blurred. We have the one map here that is the LiDAR data. We have other maps that have been sandwiched between layers of glass. And we also have the sandborne maps that are reflected backwards on mirrors, another component of glass, but it gives you the sense of sort of an archaeological excavation of a place through time. The artist Jonathan Keep also uses digital fabrication, but in a very different manner than Viviano. While he's been making traditional studio ceramics since the 1970s, again, somebody who has worked as a traditional studio craft artist, over the past 10 years, Keep has come to think of 3D printing clay as a fourth way of making for ceramic artists, the first three being hand building, throwing, and molding. It allows the artist to, and I'm quoting here from Keep, generate forms not typically visualized or created by other ceramic techniques. He continues to say, I consider myself a traditionalist, but always make the point that tradition is a continuum and that what I am doing with digital tools is just a continuation of pottery, and that is almost as old as mankind. Keep builds forms in a virtual space using Java coding, which he taught himself. And so we're looking at those forms built in virtual space here. He manipulates them using an open source software program called Blender. He then prints porcelain objects using a 3D printer he has adapted to print in clay. And I'm showing you the printer here and the object in the process of being printed here. And I think a great way to understand this is as a kind of computerized coil building. Works form layer by layer by layer. So if you imagine in a traditional coil building process, you're making a coil, you're making a coil, you're making a coil, it builds up a form. Here, the machine just knows what size and what shape to place the coil down in, and it produces the form. And this is the final 3D printed piece. I would say if anyone is so inclined, and if you are and you do, please let me know. Keep has actually provided instructions on how to make your own ceramic 3D printer that are available to anyone on YouTube. Again, if you do this, let me know. I would love to, love to see it. We actually work with an artist who teaches in the ceramic department at Emmanuel, who has indeed built one of these printers, and she's been demonstrating it at the museum, which is really wonderful. That URL is here, again, if anyone is so inclined. In the exhibition, we have 4 related but disparate vessels that comprise Keep's sound surface, Benjamin Britten, 4 sea interludes from Peter Grimes. Guided by the tone and rhythm of one interlude each from the English composer's 1945 opera, Peter Grimes, each vessel grows from the same initial point in virtual space. Subsequent points map out a vessel-shaped framework onto which that 3-dimensional computerized mesh is placed. It is progressively given texture by the rhythm and volume of Britten's masterpiece. So the surface of each vessel actually relays the sort of rhythm, texture, tones of the music. The music actually makes the form of the piece, and each piece's height actually corresponds to the length of the interlude that's being played. The power of these vessels really doesn't lie in their novelty, but in the temporal, almost narrative unfolding of their forms. It speaks to the sort of fundamentally transitory nature of music, right? A note of music is played and it's gone as soon as it's there. What would happen if you tried to manifest it as an object? That's what Keep is doing, and that's what he thinks, again, working with this 4th way of ceramic building allows him to do that artists working in the media could not do before this tool was available to them. The flexibility and mutability of tradition in the face of retooling is also key to the work of the Danish fiber artist Astrid Krogh. The title of her work here, Ikat 2, and I'm showing, if you haven't seen the piece, I'm showing the same piece in 2 views, not 2 separate pieces. The title refers to the ikat technique of resist dyeing fabrics, commonly associated with Indonesia, but also found in locations as varied as India, parts of East and Central Asia, South America. Her unique method of decoration is achieved using optical fibers, flexible and transparent threads of extruded glass that transmit light between their 2 ends. They've been around since the 1920s, and we typically think of them being used in medical circumstances or in telecommunications. However, they're flexible enough to be hand-woven on a loom, and they make up the warp of this textile here. So up and down, the weft, which a handy way to remember that is the weft runs from weft to right, is made from paper yarn, so it doesn't have a reflective capacity to it. It doesn't hold light in the same way the optical fibers do, which allows you to have this sort of wonderful vertical pull to the piece. It also allows Krogh to create one object that, even though it is a static singular object, remains in constant motion. Over the course of about 15 minutes, it cycles through a number of colorways, giving you a sense of the different ways that colors and textures can sort of run into and bleed into each other in a way that mimics sort of larger ikat dyeing. The subtle bleeding from one color to another occurs in true ikat as a result of penetrable barriers between dye and resist areas. And here, each strand of fiber optic threads, because it's treated singularly rather than as part of a block of color, allows us to have that feel. And I'm showing here the work in the gallery to give you a sense of scale. I will also say if you came through very early in the morning before the piece was turned on, you would just see a white textile. Right? The color is not inherent to the piece. It's about the way that light intercedes with it. And you can see in this work from our collection that's illustrated on the label that kind of blurring between boundaries that comes with ikat making. One of the stories from history, the history of craft, that this exhibition has allowed us to tell is that of the inextricably intertwined nature of textiles and contemporary technology, and specifically the development of computers. In 1801, the French inventor Joseph-Marie Jacquard mechanized weaving through a programmable loom that relied on a system of punch cards to control the pattern of the warp threads. I'm showing here a Jacquard loom from around 1800 in the collection of the Musée des Arts and Métiers in Paris. You can see those punch cards here that actually control the warp of the thread, the warp of the piece. This invention was later adapted by the English inventor and philosopher Charles Babbage in 1822 to produce a calculator called the difference engine. It's largely considered the predecessor to modern computers. So when you think of computers, early computers with their punch cards controlling them, this is where that idea comes from. So textiles technology intertwined for a long time and in lots of different ways. The Danish fiber artist Greta Sorensen engages the sort of interplay of light and color in works that, again, combine the traditional textiles, the use of traditional textiles, with digital fabrication and design tools that owe their existence to that early Jacquard loom. We're looking at a Jacquard weaving here, but you'll notice that it says it's a digital Jacquard weaving. After more than 40 years working solely by hand, Sorensen was introduced to the possibilities of digital weaving in the 1980s, after seeing such pieces at the International Tapestry Biennial in Lausanne. In 2005, she developed a new mode of weave construction for a digital loom, in which each colored pixel in an image, typically photographic, is translated into a visible thread or set of threads. Using a system that echoes the separation of tones into color models like CMYK or RGB, as is done in commercial paper printing or graphic design, she mixes a limited palette of 8 basic colors to achieve these kinds of smooth and photographic color gradations. And so what we're seeing here is indeed a piece that's been woven using only 8 colors of thread to get this kind of wonderful, saturated, and very dense effect. I encourage you, now that you know that, to spend some more time with it in the gallery, because it really is quite amazing how she does it. We're looking at a work here as part of a series begun in 2008, when Sorensen began to create video recordings of a sort of overgrown network of urban glowing and artificial twinkling lights, from car headlamps to stoplights to neon stop signs and illuminated billboards that define big cities. Here we're looking at a photograph that's been taken in Hong Kong. Stills drawn from these videos became motifs for large-scale tapestry weavings produced between 2010 and 2014 using a digital Jacquard loom. So I'm showing that to you here. It's amazing how much it has changed since that loom from the 1800s. This is at the Digital Lab at the Audax Textile Museum in Tilburg in the Netherlands. It's one of the few places in Europe where this type of equipment is available to artists and designers, and it allows you to use photographic and computerized imagery as the basis of your weaving. Because Sorensen's videos are slightly out of focus, the resulting image gives an impression rather than a clear picture. And it sort of, to me, echoes this sense of magical possibility inherent in the cityscape at nighttime. We're showing here that work as it's displayed in the gallery, and Sorensen often displays her work with the videos or photographs next to them, so that you can look and compare and contrast what it means to have this as a static image with a sort of deeper texture and what it means to have it as a moving videographic image. Because the two are inextricably linked through these kinds of core iconographies and locations, the contrast between textile and moving image, it encourages a dialogue about color, about depth, and physicality between forms of makings that might have once been impossible. The ceramist Greg Pace also plays with notions of variability and the moving image in his work. He asks us to see objects in different ways, depending on whether we encounter them as objects or as images. And I'm showing here a work called The Transit of Venus. It consists of a garniture set of 6 albarelli, a sort of historic form, an apothecary jar. We often think of vessels in the language of human form. We anthropomorphize these objects. Vessels have a neck, they have a foot, they have a belly, they have a lip. The Transit of Venus pushes this connection further as the vessels were thrown so that the silhouettes of figures emerge in the spaces between them. And if you can't see this, this is sort of the curvature of a back here. So when you display these vessels as a sort of garniture set, he's alluding here to sort of 18th century porcelain display techniques. They give you a story that isn't inherent in any one beautifully made object. Because these figures are only visible when displayed in a specific order, Pace really is looking to connect his work to broader ideas of the body and sequence in art. We can think of the cinematic and narrative construction of Greek vase painting, right? So we have this story that's being told in bodies around the belly of the vessel here. This is what it looks like when it's splayed out. Definitely a similarity to Pace's work. Or we might think of the wonderful photographs of bodies in motion taken in the late 19th century by the photographer Edward Muybridge using early stop motion technologies. That notion of sort of cinema and sequence and the body is very much a part of what Pace is thinking about. The figural relationships in the Transit of Venus are made even more conditional when translated into lenticular photographic images, and you can see these in the gallery. The vessels are remediated. They're translated from one artistic medium into another. They're objects that are made into images through the use of photography. So in a lenticular photograph, images of a rotating object are captured from multiple angles and interlaced together in a final print whose surface is covered in plastic lenses. Unfortunately, with the slideshow, you don't really get that sort of otherworldly effect that happens from the piece when you see it in the gallery. It's really destabilizing. It doesn't give you a sense that what you're seeing is the truth. And that's certainly very much a part of the objects and the way that they're displayed that Pace is thinking about. However, in the gallery, we show them together. Pace considers these as separate pieces. This belongs to a private collector. These will go back to the artist. So we're looking at a craft-based practice that doesn't only make craft objects, but they are essential for the practice to exist. And the content, the idea of these being ceramic vessels, informs the larger meaning of the work. It's dependent on craft for its existence. I want to talk a little bit about what analog retooling might look like. With a background in traditional Scandinavian cabinet making and furniture design, I'm showing here the artist Anton Alvarez, who created a thread wrapping machine to build objects without screws, nails, or joinery, instead relying on thousands of yards of thread coated in glue and sometimes pigmented. His device that he's made, I'm showing the thread wrapping machine here, is controlled by a foot pedal, and the operators may add chair legs or seat backs as the piece in progress spins. We're thinking about thread wrapping. It's connected to a variety of textile techniques, and we're looking at something that's both sort of analog and mechanized in Alvarez's hand. He builds furniture that's sort of using a tool that's equal parts spinning wheel and sewing machine. And I just wanted to give you a sense, if we could have a link over to the video of how this machine works. So you can see here they're threading the machine. They are getting the glue that serves as the binder here. And then where a join is to be created, it's wrapped with thread.
Can we do this one first?
So, you've got a form here. We'll wait until we get there we go. A form of textile joinery replaces the sort of complicating processes that are typically used in furniture making to join disparate materials and components. Ornamentation, rather than being applied onto a surface, is actually built into the construction itself. The decorative patterns are created through the wrapping of the textile. Alvarez, who was actually trained as a Swedish cabinet maker, he's an artist of Swedish and Chilean descent, so he knows how to do all of that wonderful joinery. He specifically locates the generation of wanting to build a new tool for a new kind of joinery in his understanding of traditional woodworking, noting, and I'm quoting here, that the machine focuses on joinery because woodworkers tend to celebrate joints and care how elements come together. I will note that piece, if you haven't seen it, is in the back page of the most recent issue of American Craft, where the title is Beginner and Master. And it speaks to this development of a new technology, but also speaking to a long history of furniture making. So finally, we're going to look at the third category, the immersive object. How can shifting the physical encounter in the gallery change our perception and understanding of the crafted object? We spend our lives in made environments. Crafted items populate our homes. Craft-intensive modes of making, bricklaying and tile work, for example, build the structures in which we sort of live, we eat, we work, and we play. Using diverse strategies, craft-based artists explore and expand borders as they define space and redefine our relationship to these materials, sort of physically or perceptually. They ask us to encounter craft in ways in which we may not be always used to encountering it. First of all, a question: how does craft rethink its relationship to architectural space? I'm showing here a work by the artist Nathan Craven, a site-specific and temporary work made for the MFA titled Poros, using ceramics as a building material with a purely artistic rather than functional or architectural context, although I would argue that this work is at once both object and architecture, and neither object or architecture. And I'm showing here the artist at work. His installations, which are largely dependent on site for their form, are composed using thousands of individual hollow ceramic elements. I have some here if you'd like to see them. After the talk, please come up and take a look with me. They don't have geometric regularity that we've come to expect of sort of a building material. Instead, they take abstract forms that reference wild flora, fauna, iconography pulled from different kinds of popular culture. Their forms are hand-carved into wooden dies, and I'm showing here how they come to the museum and some close-ups of surfaces here. Individual bricks made using recycled clay, which is pushed through an extruder, shaped into logs by the form of the die, and then cut into these pieces that are about 5 inches deep. They're then glazed only on one side and used to build these kinds of constructions that really do engage with architecture. I would note that the Museum of Fine Arts has given Craven a chance to engage directly with the architecture of I.M. Pei's West Wing, the Lindy family wing for contemporary art. I will say that when the wing opened in 1981, the New York Times architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable lauded Pei for bringing light into museum spaces, noting in her review that a return to natural light in museums after years of darkness is a cause for universal rejoicing. I'm showing here some images of the I.M. Pei Gallery here with the collections installation shortly after the building was built. And here the show New American Ceramics, or New Directions in American Ceramics in 1984, where you can see they've actually used the windowsills to show Betty Woodman's artwork. So there are 6 windows in that space. We only have one of them open to the public now. Light and art generally are not a great combination, despite what Ada Louise Huxtable has to say. So Craven's hollow forms, however, sited in relationship to this window, interact brilliantly with her directive, Huxtable's directive, to let light back into the space here. Beams of light shine through and illuminate this network of ceramic elements. It draws our attention to the window not only as a portal for looking outward, but also for its ability to define connections between exterior and interior spaces. So you can really see here the way the light is interacting with the piece. And I encourage you to look at this piece at different times of day. And once all the leaves are gone from the trees, to look at it once we have that clear light. It's very changeable dependent on the nature around it. Alison Elizabeth Taylor's work relies on an architectural language associated with the adornment of the interior rather than its structure. She combines intricate marquetry, so small pieces of wood cut and assembled. That's what you're looking at in this piece and the piece on the floor here, along with painting and staining to give us access into visual spaces that we wouldn't have access to otherwise, right? Marquetry is usually used in the context of the rich and the wealthy to show all sorts of sort of mastery of design and decorative techniques and maybe pictures that let you know something about who is residing there. Here we have marquetry being used to give us, in this work, Tap Left On, a look behind a sort of rotted out wall where you can see that it's been used to render insulation and negative space and wire. With the work Armstrong Congolium that I'm showing here, and which is located in the corner, and I hear the recognition of those sort of flooring companies from folks out there in the audience. This should be familiar to anyone who has ever refinished a floor, that you dig beneath the linoleum to find what's underneath the surface. Here we have access to it just through the use of wood. Her interest, Taylor's interest in the illusionistic capacity of painting in wood using these techniques was first piqued during a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to encounter the famous studiolo from the Ducal Palace at Gubbio. If you have not seen this, the next time you are in New York, add it to your list. The cabinets here, rendered in linear perspective so that they seem to have depth, are filled with objects reflecting the wide-ranging interests, wealth, and power of the Duke of Urbino. And I like to compare this to a work that Taylor made called Room, that's in the collection of the Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, which takes that kind of environment the Duke was hoping to create for himself, one which extolled power and prowess, and which instead speaks to the realities of life for many Americans today. It's a little more ordinary, even though it's used a sort of similar technique and is deliberately referencing that history. How do you physically render what it feels like to be part of a community? That's the question that is being asked in Charlotte Potter's work Pending, which uses glass cameos to manifest a very contemporary type of a liminal and tentative community network. It depicts profile pictures of those who have a pending friend request to be connected to Potter on Facebook, meaning that many casual acquaintances or even complete strangers inspired the sort of creation, the slavish creation of a cameo. They're displayed in interconnected clusters, and I'm showing the artist here in relationship to her work it provides a physical mapping of the artist in this kind of interstitial community. Cameo glass has been key to Potter's explorations and has been used to create small-scale and often wearable portraits since ancient Rome. I'm showing here a blue and white glass cameo of Hercules from our collection, usually showing images of people who are dear to the owner, to the wearer of the cameo, or people who are important to the society at large, rather than these kind of people that don't have a relationship with the maker. The process fuses together two pieces of colored glass. For this piece, Potter sifts white powdered glass onto darker surfaces, kiln fires the works at around 1400 degrees, and subsequently engraves images using diamond-tipped dental tools. I actually have all of the stages of a cameo that Potter has used up here. We can look at them after the course, and you can really see when you look at these objects the labor that goes into making them. There's a creation of an intimacy in the craft involved in these works that really is up against and at odds with the kind of interstitial and liminal communities that are sort of give us a false sense of intimacy online. So a question, what would it mean to be immersed in an object? I'm showing here a work by the Swedish collective A5, composed of artists who studied metalsmithing together at Konstfack University in Sweden. Projects are cross-disciplinary. Here is an installation, an ongoing installation, you'll notice, called Eon Prophet Pianoforte, where they've taken components from a stand-up piano, something that had lost its value as a playable instrument, was not being used anymore, and instead they dismantled it and made wearable jewelry components from every single part of the piano. We're actually just seeing a part of the installation here. These are photographs taken from when the whole piece was shown in Sweden, and it enveloped the viewer. It's shown differently every single time because it is a site-specific installation. And I'm showing some close-ups of the objects here. We're looking at suggestions of previous use in the way that keys have been handled, in the way that the hammers that hit the notes have been used. You have this long history of physical engagement. Each jewelry object which is wearable has a sort of quirky beauty and an appealing rawness, but allows us to face an object that we're used to encountering one way as a holistic thing and through its capacity to make sound, and to really be asked to think about it in different ways because of its translation into jewelry. I want to close with a quick look at the work of the fiber artist Roland Ricketts, who creates architectural scale installations that provide an encounter with both process and product in the same space. Much of this approach stems from his unusually intimate engagement with his materials. Ricketts learned the technique of traditional Japanese indigo dyeing while working as an apprentice on an indigo farm in Tokushima, Japan. On his current farm in Bloomington, Indiana, which actually has the same climate, roughly, as Tokushima, so that works well for him. He uses centuries-old methods to cultivate and process his own indigo, and I'm showing the artist here picking indigo leaves, and they're harvested, dried, composted into a dye stuff called tsukomo, which is then fermented in wood ash lye in order to make the indigo dye soluble and dyeing possible. And so I'm showing here a vat of the dye as it's being processed. The time spent in the farming is as much of a part of the artistic act to Ricketts as any of the other actions that must occur to create a finished object, so the dyeing and weaving of cloth, the subsequent staging of an installation. So at the MFA, we have a full-scale installation, a site-specific piece, which incorporates both elements of the indigo growing process into the installation itself alongside dyed cloth. So I'm showing the dyed cloth here, all, again, hand-woven by the artist. So we're looking at every aspect of making from beginning to end. And when you turn around the edge, you're encountered with a wall of indigo. You get the smell before you get there. Indigo is something that should be familiar to us. Anyone in this audience who has worn blue jeans, which I would guess is everyone, has had a physical encounter with indigo before. Rarely do we have access to the stuff that makes it possible, or do we have a sense of the sensory capacity of it? It's a very distinctive and unique sort of tea-like smell. You'll also notice when you go into the space that there's a sound component. Ricketts has worked with a sound artist, Norbert Herber, to add this kind of evolving process into the way that we experience the work. So recordings are done through the whole process of the growing of the indigo, of the rippling of the water that's used, everything including strapping a contact mic to a tool called the Hane, which is used to rotate the compost pile and recording those sounds, to assigning a sonic tone to every saturation of the indigo color. And so you'll notice this is gradient dyed. Depending on where you or I are in that space, you will hear different tonal sounds because of the tones that have been applied to each different saturated hue. I want to put this in the context of larger scale immersive pieces that are a part of Ricketts' work that are explored in the catalog. I'm showing here a work from 2012 called I Am I, We Are I. Again, a temporary site-specific installation created for the 2012 Cultural Festival in Tokushima, showing the entrance to the building in which it was sited to give a sense of scale. And here the artist invited professional dyers from the region to submit a length of cloth dyed in what they thought to be the most beautiful shade of blue. And so you're seeing a wide variety here, right? We're talking about tradition, but we're also talking about personal engagement and preference. These 200 cloths were installed in a space where you could be surrounded by that variance of color, and you may notice that there is actually dried indigo around the perimeter of the room, so that same sense of smell that we get in our much smaller installation is a part of the sensory experience. There is also a sonic component as well. Immersive craft, I think, at its finest. I hope that this broad overview has begun to introduce you to the riches in this exhibition, or to help you return to them in a kind of deeper way. It's on view for about another month, so I hope that you go see it again, or see it for the first time. I hope it encourages you to ask questions about making today, and to look at our historic collections anew through some of the thematic lenses that we've talked about over the course of our time together. Thank you so much.
And now we have time for a few questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. For those of you that are leaving now, please do so quietly.
Thank you so much. It was a great lecture. When you were showing the lady using molten glass to draw, I thought of Jackson Pollock sort of throwing oil paint, you know, and you're sort of blurring the lines here. My question is, the three categories you used, are those innovative ways of categorizing work, or is it a generally accepted kind of view of crafts?
I would say they're sort of neither. What they are, you know, this is the kind of show, it's not a survey of sort of contemporary ideas, but it's a snapshot of things that artists are thinking about. They are ways that when I'm looking at artists who I think are doing something new, or who are really pushing our expectations of what craft can be or how we think about it, and I'm trying to group them to make sense of them, it's there, it's inherent in the artist's work already, right? I'm not developing the categories and then slotting artists in. I'm looking at a broad spectrum of artists and saying, these people are really thinking about sort of the immersive quality of craft in a way that's different. These people are thinking about performativity in a way that's different. So I'm trying to draw out from what artists are doing ways of thinking about and talking about. I'm certainly not the first person to say use performativity in the context of talking about craft. If you're interested in say, learning more about that, there was a great show in 2010 called Hand Plus Made that was at the Houston Center for Contemporary Art that looked at performance and craft, but we're taking accepted terms and applying them to what artists are already doing. Sort of curators follow where artists lead them. I hope that answers your question.
I'm always curious, and particularly in this context, about the boundary between what we call craft and what we call art.
So I can say that my general answer when people say, well, is it art, is it craft, is that that's maybe not the most interesting question we can use to think about these objects. I'm more interested in what are the values that have historically been associated with craft. So function, whether something is handmade or not, how it fits into these material categories that we've considered in terms of craft, and say skill, which I think are the real characteristics we've often connected to craft, and how are artists who are working in these historically considered craft media today thinking about those meanings? How are they approaching and considering these historically relevant definers of craft? So to me, that how is more interesting than the sort of what, the categorizing. And to be perfectly honest, again, it's what artists who are being trained in what we considered, who are studying what we consider traditionally considered craft media and forms, it's the way they're approaching their work as well. So again, we're coming a little behind, behind the artists. I think all of these works are art and all of them are craft, right? And so you can look at them and say, how are they craft? How are they art? It's a bit of a vague answer because as much as we would like there to be one, there really isn't a, okay, well, it's craft if it's in this category and it's art if it's in this category, at least not to my perspective.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Emily, for speaking. And we welcome you down to the front to check out some of the objects.
We've got some nice objects for show and tell if you're so inclined.